about the funding and communities trying to get it in because we still haven't received know exactly the impacts of each first stage versus number two. That's what this is gathering information. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Give them a 2-minute warning or something, okay? Just letting everybody know, we'll resume in approximately 3 minutes or so. So if you want to grab a coffee or something, please feel free. You got it. Unless you guys want. Mixed. That's all right.
We have that conversation a few times behind your back. We're like, is it Mick or Michael?
I don't really care. I gotta say Michael because it sounds like professional. Yeah. Rhonda's like going like this and nudging. Stop doing that. So yeah, Ramona, just I say in a couple of minutes, just go up to the mic and because if we wait till everybody comes, but once they hear you talking, they'll stroll in. Yeah, I'm getting good feedback. Like, surprised like he was even talking to me about places. It's great. I never knew exactly where it was coming from. And I was explaining it to them. Well, TIFA teams, like some of the teams, some might be like, but I don't know people like I mean, the GSA,
make a note that we need to add First Nation school officer?
I had to I had email support because there's no legal in our UGO's office, and that's where she's printing.
Oh. Well, I'm all hooked up now. I can actually print there.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, let's hope she figures.
So if we need more, I can always grab more at lunch. Okay, there's actually quite a bit more still. I'm just gonna remove this one as a cue that I'm done. We need to learn how to do that teacher clap. That's why I said we need to learn the clap. Hello. Good afternoon. Good morning. Did everyone get a coffee and a snack? I love that color page. I love it. So we'll continue. So we went over the funding for First Nation operated schools. Thank you very much for the feedback so far. We are going to add to the presentation, so when we email it out, there will be additional slides for First Nation schools off reserve, so that will be included. So thank you very much for the feedback. So the next section of the page 3 is for students attending provincial and private schools. This part of the interim funding formula outlines the proposed approach for formula-based funding allocations to support eligible students attending provincial or private schools in Ontario. This approach uses information on school board grants calculated through the provincial formula to identify per student tuition funding by school board paid to a school board for tuition. The funding calculate does not set the amount paid to a school board for tuition fees. However, the calculation generates a source of funds to cover tuition fees for students. For students attending private schools, funding is calculated based on the nearest provincial school board to that student's First Nation residence. Is there any questions on this one? This one might have actually some questions, so I want to leave some space for that one. Good question. We missed that.
It's not here of the presentation, 23 of the, oh, for the guide?
Yeah. It's in there. Just 1 second. Thank you. No, it's not that far back. It's at the end of the grounds. 71? 74? Maybe that's why we don't have a page number.
They
starts on page 76. It's titled Part E, Tuition Funding.
Your guide is different than ours.
Yeah, Ann said page 74.
Like this morning, all your numbers you were saying
Oh,
were
the
not
way,
the
the
same.
way, because some of them were printed by two different groups.
Oh, right.
Are over there.
Oh, ours aren't the ones handed out.
No, I didn't realize that.
Oh,
Oh,
so there are,
Page numbers might be a little bit.
well, I apologize. None of that was easy to follow. My apologies. Start over, okay. Everyone leave, we'll come back tomorrow morning, we'll do it all over again. Rhonda has copies that we printed at our office. We can hand those out if you want. Oh. Should we just hand them out then? You want to hand them out or?
I don't think, they're almost through it.
Okay. When we provide the presentation, we're going to provide things like the sample side by side. We will provide the narrative overview again, and we will make sure that the numbers all line up in that email. Yeah, well, and Christina and I worked really hard to make sure the page numbers match. So that's really interesting to find halfway through, like, no, none of your numbers were matching. Yeah. So thank you for that. Okay, so back to that. Are there any questions on provincial private tuition funding? No? Okay. Line number 24 on the side-by-side is the line for administration, ancillary, and student support funding for students attending provincial schools. There are 2 enhancements applied to these students for youth and adults attending provincial or private schools off reserve. The first one is an additional 5% of the tuition amount is granted to support the administration of students, and an additional $578.33 per student is also granted to help cover the cost of student supports of those same students. So that's line 24 of the page 3 side-by-side. Oh, and I should make a note, high-cost special education is included in the private and provincial tuition calculation as well. Line number 25 is the provincial private before and after school care program. This is calculated the same way that we calculated for the First Nation operated school. So that would, I don't even know if I should say this anymore. It would be pages 67 to 71 of the overview. It's calculated the same way, but like Rhonda wanted to point out, for those students that are not attending a First Nation school, the funding is provided and outlined separately on the side-by-side for students attending provincial private. The next one is the provincial private menstrual products, and this is the same. The calculation is done the same way as First Nation operated schools, and it's just identified under a separate line for students attending provincial private schools. Oh. And if you could just identify which community you're from when you're asking a question, it helps us follow up if we have follow-up.
Okay, Ani Bojo, get to Gazipi Township. I'm from Garden River. So I'm just new to all this. Okay. It all makes sense because I used to work for the, I was an Indigenous lead for like 17 years. So all the terminology makes sense. However, I'm working in my own community at our school. But my question about the before and after school, so with that allocation, does that mean that if parents, that's a big gap in our community. I'm sure it is with in a lot of communities where parents cannot be home when the bus drops them off. So are you saying with this allocation that we can offer to cover that cost for parents that absolutely need that before and after school program?
So it's not a daycare allocation. It's meant to, it could be before and after school care, but it needs to have some sort of like teaching element to it. So there could be a tutoring program, an after school or before school tutoring program, a during lunch tutoring program, where you need to hire additional staff for those purposes. It could cover that.
Okay, there are many schools in the city that offer before and after school program for those parents who have to be before the 8:30 and until 4:30. So obviously, you cannot drop off a student at school usually around 20, before 20 to 9, so there is a gap there. And then after school, if the school closes at 3:20, at the end of the day, you can't do them there till 4:30 because even the secretaries are gone before. You know, so there's a gap there where parents may not be able to afford it, but there could be a transportation issue also.
Right. So the elementary secondary interim funding formula is for education programming. It does not include a daycare allocation. So you could use the before and after school program if there's a teaching element to it, like a tutoring program, something like that. What's that? Yeah, homework help. There's so many different models that could be adapted for that. Line 27 and 28 is the transportation calculation. This is broken into two different lines, but the first one is for students attending First Nation operated schools, and the second one is for students attending provincial private schools. It does not include, this funding does not include seasonal transportation. Yeah. Okay, so this is just a pretend. Yeah, this is not real. And I believe what happened, because Rhonda brought it up as well, I believe what happened when we started to remove things to take out personal, or not personal, identifiers, I think it actually removes funding. So this is not real, it is just pretend. And perhaps moving forward, we'll go through and zero all of these out just to make it a little less confusing. So everyone does have different, like everyone in this room would have a very different looking side by side. Some will have a First Nation school, some will not. Some will have provincial schools, some will not, or sorry, students attending provincial schools, some will not. Some will have transportation under operated schools only. Some will have transportation under provincial schools only. So everyone's side by side will look different. However, like I said, this one is just pretend. It's not even a real First Nation. And I think what happened when we removed things, it deleted out funding. Yeah, so when we look at your side by side, we can absolutely look at the individual amounts. So the transportation formula was enhanced in 21-22, I believe. Yeah, based on OTIFA table recommendations and all the work lovely hard work that gets done at those tables. So this grant provides school boards with funding to transport students to, and I'm missing a letter, from home and school, including students with special needs. This grant is made up of a base amount from the prior year's allocation and amounts from the following components: enrollment adjustment, cost update adjustment, school bus rider safety training, funding for transportation to provincial or demonstration schools, fuel escalation and de-escalation. Again, this is pages 46 to 56 of the overview. This is a huge calculation. It's quite large. The eligibility, it's assumed that all students on the nominal roll are eligible for transportation except for students enrolled in virtual, distance, or homeschool method of delivery, and those options are identified on your nominal roll, and students over the age of 21. currently in this year. Just move your chair.
I'll just take the mic to my chair.
There you go, that's even better.
For transportation, is it part of the GSNs or is this a separate allocation?
So it's part of the GSN, it has been adapted. It's just separated on the side-by-side. Yeah. That one I did already, thank you. Next. It would be on pages. On the one you have, 44, thank you. On the one we have, 46 to 56. Line number 29 is the accommodation, private home placement, and seasonal transportation for students that are away from home. So this allocation provides supports for students living away from home to complete their secondary education. This funding approach is based on the recommendations from the Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center's research analysis of the needs in students in private home placement. There are this approach addresses 3 different types of student room and board, which are again reported in your nominal roll. So there's private home placement remote, private home placement non-remote, and 5 days room and board. And I believe there's a 7 days room and board, which I may have forgotten. So I'll double check that. In our overview, it's pages 81 to 83 of the overview. And if someone can shout out the pages and the ones on your desk, that would be very great. On your desk, I keep saying desk, table. 79, okay. Starts on 79.
Just a question in regards to this line item. So if you had a community and a student was living on reserve but had to go off reserve to attend a provincial school board, I understand there's funding here, but who has that student on the nominal roll? Are they a pupil of the board because they now live in an urban setting? Or are they still on the First Nation nominal roll?
So it would be whoever's the nominal role holder. So whether it's the First Nation or someone doing the nominal role on behalf of the First Nation, they would be on that nominal role.
So they're still First Nation?
Yeah. Yeah. So First Nation students that do not live on reserve and have never lived on reserve are not included in this formula at all.
No, if it's someone who has to leave the community to attend.
Then yes, then they're included on the nominal roll. Yeah, ordinarily resident on reserve is the qualifying distinction for nominal roll.
What's an example of the middle one, the nominal?
I was actually wondering that myself and was kind of hoping no one would ask because I'm not sure. So we'll have,
That would be in the examples that she just gave. So if you're not, remote is when you have to fly north, that's remote.
right,
Non-remote is when your road access and that you can easily get back and forth, because it triggers a different level
Yeah.
of funding for the seasonal travel for your children to go back and forth to home for the holidays and stuff.
The road access.
Yeah, basically, your First Nation would know whether they're considered remote. or not.
okay, thank you, Rhonda. So then it would also then trigger the provincial transportation funding under line number 28. So if it would be non-remote, they wouldn't be getting private home placement funding. They would be bused to and from the provincial or private school, and then that would trigger funding there.
I just wanted to share my community's example. Brunswick House First Nation originally was located elsewhere, and now it's cottages for a lot of the members. One family in particular lived out there, but they had their daughter, who's in high school, live in the town of Chapel. So we got special funding. It's not remote. There's road access and everything. We got special funding for her room and board and everything. I held the nominal role, held her on my nominal role, because her primary address was that First Nation.
Okay.
But that's, I'm pretty sure where we had applied for ISK and everything, and she was non-remote. It was just a matter of internet and busing, and it's easier for her to be in town.
Thank you for that. If there are ever nominal role questions, wondering whether something is eligible or not eligible, or a particular situation, there's so many different situations. We obviously couldn't cover every single situation we have. If you have a unique situation and you believe that the child should be funded, bring that to your database officer. We have a team within our office. We get everyone together and we examine the issue and examine all of the potential outcomes and how it affects. So those individual cases, bring them to us and we discuss them, and then you're provided a written response or an email response, whether or not the student is eligible. So if you ever have any questions, please contact your database officer as your first line for that. Thank you. Okay. So this private home placement data that I have here is the non and non-remote. It does change, but I just provided one as an example. There are amounts that are not in here because it changes for every First Nation as well. But this will just give you kind of a general understanding of the additional funding that's provided for students attending provincial private school outside of their community that had to move. So room and board, that doesn't change for students. It's $12,000. It's based on a $1,200 monthly allocation for 10 months. Student allowance and ancillary services is $1,516. There's also funding in there for a transit pass for the students at $1,030, and there's an average calculation done for transit passes in Ontario, and then that's multiplied by the 10 months. There's seasonal transportation. You'll see in the south it's $1,387, but in the north it's unknown. Like I said, it changes for every First Nation depending on distance. There's a $76.33 that's provided for a criminal record check for the home that the child is staying in. There's also a travel chaperone. For the south, it's $173.49, but for the north chaperones, because they have to travel farther or more remote, $578.30. And there's also transitional support of $1,609.99. So like I said, this varies definitely depending on the First Nation. So this calculation can go up and down for those students. Any questions? Oh, page numbers? 81 to 83. Oh, question?
Hi there, my name is Murray Wabus, and I'm with the Neskantaga Education Authority. Just a quick question about the criminal reference check. Is that just for the boarding home, or is that for the student?
For the boarding home parent.
Boarding home parent,
Yeah.
okay. What if there's more than one boarding home parent? So just say, for example, if it's a family that's over the age of 16 or whatever, which you have to have, like I would recommend anyways,
Right.
as administrator, that anybody over a certain amount of age, and if they're living in that same residence, they would need to be checked as well. wouldn't they be?
That's an excellent question, thank you. I'm not sure currently how the agencies that manage private home placement or the First Nations themselves, what their requirements for that are, but we'll definitely look into that one. And add it, yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I don't have an immediate answer. Thank you.
I have one question. I know, I understand that this is for a lot of remote communities or the other communities coming up. What about circumstances where there's athletes that could include it, so they will go off their reserve into bigger percentage? Does this same application, does it apply? Does the same formula apply?
So, and what I just mentioned earlier, if you have a case where you believe the student is eligible, definitely bring it to your database officer. When you're bringing information to your database officer, we're going to ask specific information. Christina, do you know offhand what we're going to be asking?
Well, in some cases, if it's a choice, that a portion could be covered, like the tuition portion only, and then the family, or if they have help maybe from the First Nations, if there are funds for that, but they would take care of additional costs that might be sort of outside what normally would be funded.
Right. But yes, please bring those issues, please bring those cases forward to us so we can discuss them. Okay. So, in 2019-20, when the formula was introduced, the formula, it calculated funding. That was the first year that the formula was run. This funding was then compared to 17-18 levels, and funding protection was implemented for 3 years to help support communities to the transition to the formula that the formula may have generated less. So funding protection brought it up to 17-18 levels for 3 years, and then an additional year was added for 22-23. Effective April 1st of this year, the 17-18 funding levels are now subject to a gradual step down of 1.5%. So each year moving forward beyond this year, the 17-18 levels will go down by 1.5%, which will generate less funding protection.
Why is that?
Pardon me?
Why is it going down?
Why is it going down? So it was a 3-year initiative that was put in place to help First Nations transition. The idea was that it was going to disappear completely, and then a decision was made to do a 1.5 gradual step down. A lot of the enhancements that have been done to the formula have replaced the need for funding protection. The amount of funding protection that's currently generated for all of Ontario has significantly decreased because of the enhancements and additional things that were put into the formula.
If you go on page 84, or I don't know what page it's on, the other one, it talks about stabilization.
Right, and then we implemented stabilization this year.
I have a question.
Oh.
Just to clarify, so if you were a nation that did not receive funding protection, that there's no 1.5% decrease in that line, but what you're saying is to those nations that did have funding protection, there's other things going up to replace what they're losing. So what about those communities that didn't have funding protection?
Well,
There's-
you're also getting the enhancements.
They're also getting
Yeah.
those enhancements.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So in 21-22, there was a big enhancement that was done at the end of the year that included things like the menstrual products, the changes to the transportation formula. There was another one in there that was important. A lot of those enhancements replaced funding protection. It became part of the formula and it generated funding based on nominal roll, so not comparing it to 17-18 levels anymore. So it generated more funding, thereby decreasing the funding protection in 21-22.
So just to clarify, there's the 4 areas of funding protection and then the 1.5% decrease applies per funding protection area.
Yes, to the 17-18 level.
Yeah, so some communities might see more than a 1.5% decrease if they have funding protection in one or more areas.
It would be to the 17-18 level. So the 17-18 levels is actually what's decreasing. When you run the formula currently in 23-24, it looks back to the 17-18 levels for all the various different areas, and it's the 17-18 level that's decreasing. So this year it looked back and it's 1.5% less, so therefore less funding protection is calculated.
I'm just seeking clarification. I understand how the bottom line might be more or less, but you just mentioned that those enhancements, they now bring additional expenses that the communities didn't have before. So if you're saying that, oh, well, because you got more money for menstrual products, the community didn't have that expense before. So now they have that additional expense, but they don't have that generated funding, so they still need funding protection in those other line items to cover expenses that they now have that they didn't need or have before. So I understand what you're saying is like the bottom line all balances out, but that's not true because they now have additional expenses in those line items that need to generate more money. So you're looking at a pot of a bottom line that might be comparable to funding last year, but they have additional expenses. So you can't say, I'm giving you more money in this pot, but and not giving it over here, and think that it's even, because they now have more expenses.
So some of the enhancements aren't like that. So for example, the transportation enhancement, that it enhanced the transportation formula and provided additional funding for communities, but it was already in there. So some enhancements do add, and then some, like you said, would add an additional expense. Yeah. So this year, stabilization was introduced. The funding stabilization is a formula measure designed to ensure a stable and predictable funding level from year to year. Although measures of this nature may exist provincially, they generally assume that a school district is managing a larger district-level budget and can adjust for decreases to an individual school within that larger budget. First Nations schools do not generally benefit from a larger board-level budget and are therefore more vulnerable to funding changes due to enrollment or provincial rate decisions. So stabilization, and I don't think I have a summary yet.
I just have a question from the last slide.
Okay.
So there's a decrease of 1.5 from 17-18. So the word gradual, is it 17-18, then 18-19, 19-20?
No.
So it's just, this year, it's just 1.5.
So 17-18 this year, the 17-18 level has a 1.5 decrease. Next year, the 17-18 level will be decreased by 3%. The year after that, 4.5%. The year after that, it's always going to refer back to the 17-18 level. And that level will slowly decrease.
So this year it's 1.5, next year it's 3?
Yeah,
And then year after, we're losing 4.5%?
yeah.
Wow.
funding protection. There's communities that don't even have.
Right. Yeah, there's many communities that don't utilize funding, that don't receive funding protection. So the stabilization portion of the side-by-side line 31 will help communities. So if overall funding is decreased by 1.5, the stabilization kicks in. It's a 2-year calculation, starting the year that your funding drops below the previous year. I don't have the whole calculation in here because it's actually quite complicated to see. You need to draw it out. But when if you're funding this year, 23-24, dropped below 22-23, stabilization kicked in and helped bring it up a little bit. And then there's also a second year component based on this year. So next year, you'll also receive stabilization funding based on this year's decrease. Should you drop below again, then you'll enter back into step 1. And then the year after, you'll get step 2. But in that second year, you'll get step 1 and step 2 from the first year. It's really complicated. It's why I didn't try to map it all out. Okay, so page 83 has the calculation examples in the coup narrative overview to help explain stabilization.
Just jumping back to Murray's question, on page 82 of ours, I don't know if it was a coup, it actually identifies 2 criminal record checks.
So not everyone above 18 in the household.
But we can bring that forward.
Okay, okay. To answer Murray's question about the criminal record check, stepping back a couple, so the 7633 is to cover 2 boarding parents in the formula. It doesn't say anything about the 18 and over in the house, or sorry, 16 and over in the household that you mentioned, but we're definitely going to bring that and inquire. Yeah. And the last one that I'm going to talk about, but not the last one on the side-by-side here, is provincial funding outside the GSN, which is the Priorities and Partnership Fund. This funding is formulated based on the Ministry of Ontario's Priorities and Partnership Fund. It's meant to address the current year's priorities and are not meant to be ongoing. That is line 32. And I obviously stopped putting pages. I must have known we would run into this issue. But that is on page. Is that why I don't have it? It could be. Okay, so that's why. Okay, so there's no page number for that one. And then the last item, 33, is high-cost special education, which Christina covers in her portion of the presentation. What time is it? 11:30. Any questions? No? Thank you.
Sorry, before you sit down.
So close.
Yeah. For the provincial funding outside the GSN, where do you find, is there a list of those opportunities or those partnerships that we can tap into?
I'll look into that for you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Ramona. Now we'll just flip over to the next page in the side-by-side, and we can go on to second-level services. And then when I do that, you can switch. So you can switch. Okay, so we can start with just taking a look at what second level services are or what they can include. So this is a list of some examples, but not limited to these things. So second level services, which can be provided by a First Nation or by another organization appointed by the First Nation. So things like policy and advocacy, capacity building, professional development and training, program and curriculum development, administration, management, coordination and delivery of programs and services, professional services, development and support, school evaluation services and support, human resources, communication, special education, education specialists, professional development for teachers, networking, technical support, research for schools, and regional education organization structures. So those are some examples of what second level services can be, but there may be new things that come up that would fall into this category. Okay, so as I mentioned, second level services can be provided by a First Nation themselves or can be delegated to another organization. And that would provide the services to their students on their behalf. So in this case, then the First Nation there would be an agreed upon amount that would go to the service providers so they can provide the service. And we'll talk a little bit more about service mapping as we go along, and that section on your side-by-side that indicates where currently any funding is being redirected to second-level service providers. So it is the responsibility of a second-level service provider to have communication with their First Nations, the students they're serving, on a regular basis, so each party knows what to expect and what's agreed upon, what services are being provided, etc. And then there's a link here to the National Program Guidelines, where you can also find more information on second-level services and what's eligible and whatnot, and you might get some ideas. Mostly for that section, what you'll see is the list that we just went over. But that can be referred to yearly. Okay, so there's a bit of history with second-level services and how they started out before the formula, and then the ways they got integrated in, and the way things stand now. So in prior years, prior to the formula, so say 2017, 2018, and before, there were certain student services that were provided through programs that are now legacy programs, such as New Paths and First Nation Student Support Program. So with the formula, because those services provided through these prior proposal-based programs were really necessary to everyone, to every student. And so it wasn't necessarily fair, I suppose, that if one organization was better at preparing a proposal than another, there might not be equity in what was being received. So those services were then rolled into the formula so that they're calculated evenly for everyone. At the time, though, before the formula, with some larger organizations, so it was perhaps a tribal council, would have applied for these programs on behalf of multiple First Nations. And so then we're providing these services on behalf of the ones who had joined in with them on those as part of the proposal. So once it went into the formula, to not just stop those agreements or arrangements that had been made, it was decided to continue the funding to the service providers, so the continuation of the service being provided to the First Nations and students without a break. And so now that amount was calculated in each First Nation formula calculations, but that portion that was going was now being redirected back to the second level service provider. So, and I'll show a snapshot in a minute of where you can see that on your side-by-side, and it indicates who your second level service providers are and how much is being redirected there. So if you were to have questions about that, about the services that are being provided, then it's encouraged that you continue to build the relationship with your second level service provider and have communication to know, okay, what services are being provided? Is this what we want? Is it adequate? Or do we want all of these services provided? Do we want more? So that communication can happen and is definitely encouraged. Okay. Okay, so within the formula, then the amount generated as second level services was capped at 15%. So of the allocation, 15% can be considered second level services or to be used toward that, and the 85% direct student services for education. And that's for First Nation schools, but for students attending provincial schools, 5% is added for second level services. So that would be to whichever nominal role the student is on, normally a First Nation, but there are some exceptions. So an additional 5% is allocated to cover the second level services to support those students attending provincial schools. Okay. Okay, let's see here. So at the beginning, the option was presented to discuss these agreements with second level service providers. And that's still there and encouraged. So this can be, this is where another area where the funding protection might become involved because some of the funding that does get redirected to second level service providers some of it might be protected, funding protection. Not in all cases, but in some cases it may be. Particularly if the service provider doesn't hold their own nominal role, but provides these services anyway on behalf of numerous First Nations. So in this case, this will experience, the First Nation may experience the 1.5% as it gets decreased from the service provider. It will get drawn in from the First Nation to keep the service provider at the same level. Okay. Yep.
Sorry. I don't know all the acronyms. What is IFA?
Well, IFA is Interim Funding Approach, is really referring to when we say Interim Funding Formula, it's the same, but the approach is a little more broad. It might sort of refer to the whole package, not necessarily all of the details within the formula. We generally would, there's just some, I guess, maybe discussion what would be a more suitable what wording would best represent it. So it's basically the same thing right now. Thank you.
I can just provide some clarification because I know the IFA is the acronym I use, and so I realize I am causing the confusion now. But we use the Interim Funding Approach, IFA, when we're talking about the formula, which the ladies have been going through, plus the enhancements, because that's outside of the formula. So when we say the approach, we're talking about the formula plus the enhancement. When we just talk about the IFF, which is the Interim Funding Formula, then it just is talking about the formula. So that's the difference, and that's how we have approached it, which I guess is probably confusing for a lot of people who don't speak our language every day, but yes, so that's what it means. They're the same thing, but the approach just talks about the enhancements, whereas the formula is just kind of the formula.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Angel. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, so now we can look directly at the side-by-side if you like. And so we see here second-level services. Okay, First Nation schools. So you can see levels that were allocated in 2017, 2018, and this ties into a few things, but you can see the core funding, and then you see non-core funding. So what you see under the column non-core funding generally would have been those proposal-based programs. And so those amounts there are often, in each side-by-side is unique, but that will often be the funding that's being redirected if there is a second-level service agreement with someone else. Okay. And then just under that, there's the second-level service distribution for provincial schools. So this is a similar idea. And this, you can see the different program names on the side here where funding was generated before, and those are the codes that were used at the time. And so next slide, we have a legend for that, but the coding has changed since this for how the funding is allocated now. So you see in your allocation letters Q codes like Q24F, Q2AG, and those are the new codes that funding is streamed through. But prior to the formula, these were the codes in place, and you can see them associated with the different programs. And the same idea that in the column that's not core, those may be the amounts that you'll see are being redirected. Also, these totals, so these levels of funding for in 2017, 2018 are the base levels for funding protection. So if, say, in this fiscal year, 2023, 2024, your allocations didn't meet the levels of 17, 18, what was received then, that difference would be the funding protection amount. But in many cases, what the formula is generating is over and above 17, 18 levels, and so there's no need for any top up in the way of funding protection. But there still are some cases where the generated amount might be less than these 17, 18 levels, and that's when funding protection happens, and that this 17, 18 level is what is. It was going to disappear, but then it was supposed to be 3 years, then it was extended, and then rather than just cutting it off so quickly, it was decided to do a 1.5% decrease. So it was a gradual decrease. Okay. Okay, so this is the next thing you should see on the side-by-side. And this is where, like, if you if you have the generic sample, it won't have any service providers on it, but on your own side-by-side, you will see the service providers that are providing the second level services, that'll be listed here. And this is, I mean, prior years, they weren't actually listed, the amounts were listed, but it was to provide more clarity and just information to make sure everybody knows. Then these were added this year, so you should see your service provider. You see at the beginning, the first column, the code that relates to where this funding originated, what programs before the formula. So in the box, you can see that there's a code for new paths and whatnot. So that helps to identify where the funding originally came from and what funding is being redirected, and maybe what services would be associated with that, or that you would want to be associated with that. Yes?
Sorry, another question. So what you were just explaining there is on the bottom of page 4. So it says provider 123 under P2103. Is that amount that is the capped amount, or is that an amount that was provided by a service provider? Like, so if we get a service provider, do they have to fall within that, or is that just an example of an amount?
Well, these numbers on here are just an example, but on your own side-by-side, it will be the actual amount that has been redirected and given and allocated to your service provider, so that rather than you, just the way it was set up from the start for the continuation of the services, rather than you having an agreement direct and paying the invoice, it just left like that to not interrupt any services. So it's you, out of the funding that's generated for you, say Garden River, it's then that portion, that was the portion you were contributing to those services from the service delivery organization, maybe tribal council, then that gets redirected automatically. So you never see it go to your bank account. It gets generated in your funding, but then rather than go directly to you, it gets moved over and goes directly to your service provider.
Okay, and is this on top of the regular tuition, that's the same amount for the provincial schools? So if provincial schools are 15,000, is it an additional, sorry, I got to think about that. An additional 8,757 to the tuition? In addition to the tuition, I mean?
The tuition wouldn't be a part of this, so your tuition goes directly to you, and then you have a tuition agreement with the school boards you're working with, and then they invoice you, you pay them directly. But in that case, you receive 75% of your tuition allocation estimate at first, and then once the nominal roll comes in, and your invoices come in, it gets reconciled with the balance. So that should enable you to have full amount to pay the tuition invoices. So that's not transferred to another.
Okay, thank you. So another question. So if the service provider, let's say, is the tribal council, do we see any of this money in our own bank account from what you're describing under the service co-provider 2103 to 2107? Does any of that come into our bank accounts?
No, those are the amounts that get redirected. So it never does go in. It goes automatically to the service provider, the way things are now. And that's where we are going to touch on service mapping. So those agreements of service were established before. And so they can be renegotiated, and that's called a service map change. So you say you see your amount, oh, you have $2,000 going to ABC organization to provide ABC services. And maybe you need to revisit, well, what services are we actually receiving? And, you know, maybe we want more services, maybe not. Like, so this whole process, and we'll talk about it in a minute, takes a little bit of time, but it is possible. But as it is now, those amounts you see in this particular section are being, you only see it here. You don't see the actual funds. The actual funds go to your service provider.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
I think I can clarify why Mona is confused, if I could say you're confused, Mona. Because underneath the example, you said the service codes match from the bottom to where they are pulled from the top. So the P2103 is listed as provincial tuition. So I think that was just an error in the coding that were used on the bottom. Is that maybe clarify your question, Mona?
Yeah.
So it goes back to, this is just a pretend side by side.
Yes, but I think that's because she's never
I
seen
can
this before.
definitely
so
see
that's
that
why she
confusion.
sees that.
For some, the tuition may be redirected. So that could be why it's on here. Some First Nations do have other organizations or even another First Nation managing their tuition. So it could be on here. So that's why. When we look at your individual side by side, and I really hope we have time today to sit and look specifically at yours, we can help explain the things that may not make sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can see. Yeah, it is confusing no matter what. So, yeah, so thank you. Are there any other questions right now about this? Okay. All right, so. Okay, so now I believe we're going to the next page. Yeah, so we can go to the next page of the side-by-side now, page 5. And this is the last page of the side-by-side. Okay. So here we have some information about special education. So with special education, prior to the formula, there was an amount that was jointly with Chiefs of Ontario was set, with OTIFA was set. With the formula, it generates high-cost special education right within core funding. So that's what's happening on this page, is that it's showing how much is being generated in the core funding for high-cost special education. And it also relates it back to these 17, 18 levels. So in a similar way, if the funding that's generated within the formula doesn't match or doesn't meet or exceed, I should say, the high-cost special education funding that was received in 2017-18, then that is supplemented and increased to meet that level. Okay, so that's why sometimes with the high-cost special education report, you may not have to complete it if the funding is all part of the core allocations, it's all part of nominal roll. But if you get this top up, you'll see funding coming through codes Q28N, which is high-cost special education First Nation, or Q28P for provincial, high-cost special education provincial students. So that's where any top-up would come through, and so that's why those are the amounts that you use when you're completing your high-cost special education report. And then that would also include any proposal-based high-cost special education funding that was applied for or received. So those are reported on. The amounts generated within the formula aren't. They're part of nominal roll. So that's why not everyone always has a high-cost report to complete. Okay.
Sorry, I have a question for you.
Sure.
And it's going to be on this next slide that you're going to discuss, but
Next.
in regards to the special education amount paid within the provincial tuition, why does it always seem like the province gets more money than we do on our spec ed allocation?
So are you on the next slide?
Yes.
Or are we on provincial here?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the amount that's showing for the provincial is the estimated amount that will be included in the tuition that you're paying them, right? So it's not that you're receiving it and having to pay for it. In addition, it's estimated as well. This is the portion according to the provincial school, according to what is included in their tuition cost. This portion is the estimated amount that is going toward high-cost special education. So then that estimate gets put on here as sort of that's already been allocated for high-cost special education.
Okay, so it would be based on our nominal roll numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's based on nominal roll too, but it would all add up by student. And well, different boards have different tuition rates too, and maybe different estimates for high cost. So it can vary, but it can still, if that amount that's being estimated as being generated through provincial doesn't exceed your 17, 18 levels, then that will be topped up.
Okay.
Yeah, but
I'll ask you other questions
yeah,
later.
we could look more specifically. Thank you. Okay, so in this case that we see here, in the bottom there you can see, okay, so the amount generated exceeds 17, 18 levels, so no additional funds to chop that up or bring it up to that level are needed in this case. But they are needed in some cases. Okay. So that's what this slide is, just showing that. Yeah, next slide, please. Oh, yeah. Just reiterating that the difference between the amounts, well, we're saying 23, 24, but this would be next year too, and it was last year too. So the current fiscal year, it gets raised to meet that amount. Okay, the 17, 18 level. Okay, so if there are any questions, or maybe this might be something to look at more specifically with your own side-by-sides this afternoon. Okay, so as I mentioned, we would just come back to service mapping for a minute. This is sort of an overview, but it is something that can be discussed further, and it might even warrant its own presentation at some point. But just as an introduction and overview, first, the idea of service mapping, that certain services are being provided by another service provider, and funds are being redirected to that service provider so that the services are being provided on your behalf or on behalf of a First Nation, say, or a First Nation maybe providing second level services on their own. But if there is a service provider, then that means, and money's being redirected, that means that there's a service map. Okay? And service maps can be looked at. The first step, first of all, if you're considering finding out more about the services that are being provided, would be to communicate directly with your service provider and say, oh, okay, well, I see that this much, is being provided to you to provide these services. What services are being provided, and can we review that? And that would be recommended first step. Then, if a First Nation may decide, well, we want to provide some of these services ourselves, or maybe a First Nation might decide they want the service provider to provide more services on their behalf, there could be changes you'd like to make to the agreement or arrangement, so that can be negotiated. If you wanted to not have, if your agreement changed, that you wanted to change the service map and say maybe there would be more money being directed or less, the process would take approximately a year, because it all has to be incorporated into the formula and into your calculations for the next year coming up. So there would need to be discussion with your service provider and agreements. There may be a need for BCRs, bound council resolutions, to change these things, but they can be looked at, and it would be a good idea to revisit those. But together, those changes can be made if needed. Next one, please, Ramona, well, I guess we should leave this for a minute. So this slide I kind of covered it with the first one, but yeah, just so you can see it visually as well. So those are the general steps, sort of framework in place right now, how to go about investigating your service mapping and maybe negotiating a change. Okay, and then on this page here, in which you'll receive this later, we have the contacts for each area. So we welcome you, of course, to contact any of us at any time that you want to discuss something or if you have a question. We're all listed there. We have Susan Troniak, our Director of Education and Social Programs Directorate. Okay, and you see Rhonda Beauvais, the Manager of the Education Unit, Ramona. You see Faye Zokol, who works with regional education agreements, myself, and then we have Eric Halverson working closely with the tuition invoicing right now. So, and then the contact information's all here for you. Oh, and we have a handout that's going to go around with all of this as well. Contact information. Okay, so thank you very much for this opportunity to present.
So thank you so much to the ISC team for that really informative presentation. We've got a prize to give out.
Is everybody get a ticket for a door prize? If you see it, let me know.
So again, as Angel's passing out those tickets, keep your hands in the air. Just a reminder, we'll have lunch from 12 till 1. And when we come back is when we'll divide the room. If you signed up for an individual session with Indigenous Services Canada to look at your side-by-side, that'll be on one side of the room for the time that you wrote in the time slot. And on the second side of the room will be a general presentation on reporting. Okay? Does everybody got a ticket?
And we'll
Oh.
post we'll post the sign-up list on each of the sides of the tables where they're gonna be set up, so you know which table to go to.
To go to? Okay, so Angel was saying we're going to post the list of the signups and what table to go to, just so when you come into that room, you'll see where you need to go. Okay, one more time. Last call. Tickets, raise your hand. I see a hand over here. I think Maureen doesn't have. Oh, she does? Okay.
Yeah, so she doesn't need to come and put, no, not yet. She needs to come and put the extras in here, but I'm gonna go get the prizes, because I don't have them.
Okay, cool. Okay, are we just trying one prize? No. 3 right now. Okay. Yeah, I think we're about to do that. Yeah. Let's see which it is. 2. Okay. Okay. Is it the last 3? I would be last 3 numbers, eh?
I don't know, because I think that's Tuesday before the tickets.
Okay, if you have a blue ticket, last 3 numbers 019. Eight 6019. All right. And if you have a black ticket, awesome. And if you have a black ticket, the number is 085 90622. All right, awesome. Congratulations. So I believe lunch is ready, and it's out that door. And again, we'll begin promptly at 1 o'clock after lunch. All right. I'm just going to tuck this in here.